Hi, today I'm going to show you how to do a trigger mod, or a trigger job, whatever you want to call it, on your Smith Wesson M&P 9mm. This should also work on the 40 caliber as well, as all the internal parts, as far as I know, are the same. This video clocks in at just under 40 minutes. The reason being is I wanted to make it as detailed as possible, because doing this you do have to be careful. So I suggest you watch the entire video first before you attempt this job. I don't expect this job to change the trigger pull at all. When I first took this out of the box a couple of weeks ago, straight from the box, the trigger was about 7 pounds 5 ounces. So I'll test it at the end of the job and we'll see if we saved any weight, although I'm not expecting it. What I am expecting is to make this a lot smoother. Smith & Wessons are notorious for having a gritty trigger out of the box, so we're going to fix that. To do this job, ideally you should have all these tools. You're going to need a hammer, a large flathead screwdriver, a pair of needle nose pliers, a 1/8 inch punch, a small screwdriver, a drill, Dremel tool. You're going to need a couple of felt pads for the Dremel tool, a hard felt pad and 2 soft ones. And if you have it, a very, very fine grit polishing stone. Also some metal polish, a rag, and some 600 grit and 1500 grit waterproof sandpaper. Optionally, you should also have a set of soft jaws for your bench vise, which we'll also need, a roll pin starter punch, a roll pin punch, and a nylon tipped punch. The first step will obviously be to separate the slide from the frame. So we'll go ahead and do that. Simply pull the slide back, lock it back. Inside you will see a small yellow or greenish lever. That's the sear release lever. You just need to push that down. Put the takedown lever down, and the two halves come apart. We'll start by dismantling the frame. The pieces of the frame we're going to be polishing will be where the trigger bar meets the plunger. We're going to give the sear a little polish as well. That will involve taking out the sear housing, and also to get this trigger bar out we need to remove the trigger block, or sorry, the locking block. First step in dismantling the frame will be to remove the takedown lever. This just takes some playing with, basically. Next we'll be punching out these 2 roll pins. Incidentally, these are interchangeable. They're the exact same dimensions, these 2 roll pins, so no need to keep track of them. And we'll be removing the locking block pin as well. We'll start by removing the main locking block pin here. This needs to be pushed out from the right side of the firearm. So you want to grab your bench block, or what you're using as a bench block. I'm just using a hockey puck with a hole in the middle here. You're going to grab your 1/8 inch punch and simply gently tap it out. Next we'll punch out the front roll pin. It doesn't really matter what side of the firearm you punch these out from. You can use your 1/8 inch punch, or better yet, if you happen to have one of the optional tools, a roll pin punch, use that. There's a little nipple on the end, and what that does is prevent deformation of the roll pin. Now we'll do the back one. It's the same size punch. If your Glock, or sorry, if your Smith & Wesson is newer like mine, you'll find these pins to be pretty tight. Next we will remove the locking block. This is pretty snug in the frame. So this is what we're going to use that large flathead screwdriver for. You're just going to gently pry and the locking block will come off. Just a note here, I don't know if you saw this little spring come off. This little spring just sits into the locking block in this groove here. So make sure you don't lose that. Now we can remove the slide stop lever. And we can also pull the trigger out. To remove the sear block, you also need the screwdriver. And again, because these are tight, you're just going to pry gently and rock the sear block back and forth, and that will come out as well. Since I have the sear block off for this job, I'm just going to show you what the purpose of this the sear release lever is. Normally that lever is in the up position like it is now, and the sear is up as well. That's what grabs hold of the striker and stops your slide from coming off. That's the reason why you need to push this down, and you'll see here it depresses the sear. Now to remove the sear, we just need to push out this pin here. No need for a hammer. This just gently pushes out. Once it's out that far, you can grab it from this side. You want to hold down the sear just in case the spring pops out. I'll show you here. Now this little yellow spring stayed in. You can leave that in. There's no need to take it out because it's a bit of a bugger to put back in. This little piece here sits on top of the spring, and here's the sear, the part we're going to be polishing. Now I'm going to stop here for a moment, and you may notice my plunger already seems pretty polished. Well, that's because it is. I'm redoing this video because I had a hard drive crash on my video camera and lost all my disassembly footage. I managed to save my polishing footage, so I'll be inserting that into this video. So this is the piece you're going to be polishing. This is a piece that needs to be really smooth for the trigger bar, because the trigger bar rides on top of it. Let's see if I can get an angle here to show you. When you pull the trigger, the top, this angled part of the trigger bar is what hits on your plunger and pushes it down, like so. Okay, let's go ahead and disassemble the slide. Obviously take your recoil spring out and your barrel. Now we need to remove this back plate. To do that, just grab your small screwdriver. You're going to be depressing this white plastic piece here down and then sliding off the back plate. To completely remove the striker pin, you need to depress the plunger. You heard that click, and that releases the striker. Now, unlike the Glock, the Smith & Wesson, in order to remove this safety plunger, you need to drift out your sight. So that is why I suggest you have a nylon punch so you don't mar the sight as you drift it off. If you are going to use a regular punch, I highly recommend taping up the end. You can use masking tape or duct tape, just anything to stop you from scratching your sight. Okay, we now have to put your slide into the vise in order to drift out that sight. Now this is the reason you want a set of soft jaws to go over your metal jaws. If you don't have these, 2 pieces of wood will probably do. So I'm going to go ahead and put my slide in here. Clamp it in snug. It doesn't have to be especially tight. You want to drift off the sight from the left side. So if you're looking at the gun from the back as normal, you drift it from the left side. Now these sights have a locking screw in here. If yours hasn't been taken off yet, I believe the factory put some red Loctite on those, so it might be snug. You might not get away with a small L-shaped Allen wrench. I ended up bending mine because it was so tight. So what I'm going to use is a screwdriver. So just go ahead and loosen it off. You don't have to remove it all the way, just until it gets loose. And again, this is where you should have a nylon punch, or as I said, a regular punch, but have it protected. So I'm just going to drift out this sight. Now you notice when it starts getting loose, you don't want to punch it off all the way. The reason for that is, I'm just going to move it by hand here. You'll see this plunger starting to come up. That's what holds the spring and the safety plunger in place. So you need something to hold that down so it doesn't go flying across the room. These are very small parts, and I wouldn't want to go looking for them on carpet, that's for sure. So you can either take this apart on your bench. I just pulled everything out here. In order to polish that plunger, that round plunger, you can't really do it by hand because you'll get uneven polishing or sanding. This is where the drill comes in. So I'm going to put my drill in my vise. You don't have to do this in a vise, you can hold the drill with your hand, but I find this a lot easier. So again, we're just going to snug the drill up in the vise. That should do it. Okay, hopefully you can see the profile of this plunger. You'll see it is slightly rounded, but there's a sharp edge here at the bottom. So the idea in polishing this is going to take out any machining marks, and also to reduce the amount of grit when that trigger bar passes over the sharp edge. I will probably try to take out this sharp edge completely. I'll show you what I mean when I get to polishing it, but you should probably be careful about that. So what we need to do first is mount this in the end of the drill. You want to mount it in such a way that it's not going to wobble. Again, you don't really have to make it too tight. It's not going to be having a lot of resistance. You're just going to be sanding this with the drill running. Okay, I've changed the camera around to give you a better angle, hopefully. I'm going to start with some 600 grit to try to get that edge down. I am going to put a couple of drops of oil. And you don't want to be running your drill at high speed. So I have it setting on the screwdriver setting, and I have a variable speed drill, so I'm able to control the speed with the trigger. So I'm going to start off really slow here, not applying a lot of pressure, basically just trying to round off this corner. Just going to grab a rag. Pretty smooth already. As I mentioned, I have already done this job, but I lost the video as I explained earlier, so it was already pretty smooth to begin with. But I think I want to round off this corner just a little bit more. Now, I wouldn't recommend doing this step. I'm going to actually use a polishing stone to round off that corner more. You run the risk of taking too much material off. So if you don't feel comfortable doing that, just stick with the 600 grit sandpaper, get it polished up to your satisfaction, and then go to the 1500 grit and do the same thing. And finally, it's the metal polish. I'll get onto that in a second. Okay, I have a set of 3 polishing stones. This is the finest grit one I have. So I'm going to go ahead and start this. Actually, I'm going to put some oil on this stone. That actually feels really good now. So now I'm going to follow up with my 600 grit paper again. Basically what you want to do is keep going until you're comfortable. Be really careful not to take any material right from the top here. If you do take material from the top, it may stop the plunger from going in far enough when the trigger bar hits it. So what I'm doing is I'm avoiding sanding or polishing the top too much, but I am doing the roundness of this corner. I don't know if you can notice on camera or not, but it definitely looks a lot more rounded to me now. And finally, before we get to polishing, I've got my 1500 grit here. I'm going to run that on this plunger a bit, and then we'll get to the metal polish to finish things off. So again, I'm just going to add a bit of oil here. Okay, I see no more marks on this from the sanding. So the final step is to take your metal polish, and I'm just going to put a little bit on the tip of my rag here. Okay, I think I'm pretty happy with that. Now the other piece you want to polish on the plunger is the other side of the plunger. The lips at the top here, they ride up and down inside that hole in the slide. So you don't really want to, maybe you can give that a quick 1500 grit sand with hardly any pressure, and then just you want to polish that edge. So again, we're just going to turn this around. Put it in the drill. Just going to grab my 1500 grit. Again, just very lightly. Basically, that's all you want. Just going to clean it up with my rag a bit. And again, finally with the metal polish. So again, just a tiny bit on the end of your rag. Okay, again, that looks pretty good. So we'll take this off. I'll move my camera back to the bench since we won't be using the vise again until we put the rear sight back into the slide when we're all done. Okay, so we're done rounding off our safety plunger. I'm just going to do a rough diagram here of what it looked like before. So what we've done by rounding it off is we've made this look as much as possible like that. Now for the trigger bar, because this piece here rides on the plunger, just like that, we're going to sand and polish this section here. We are also going to sand and polish this section here where it meets the sear. Let me just grab my sear here if I can find it. So here's the sear. This is the way it sits in the gun. You'll see this part right here. We're also going to be polishing that. Rides along this slope here. So when you pull the trigger bar goes back and makes the back of the sear go down, releasing the striker. Okay, I've got the sear secured in a pair of needle nose pliers. I've just put some masking tape on the pliers as not to damage my sear. I'm just going to dip my finger here in the metal polish, put a bit on the sear, and I'm going to grab my Dremel with the polishing pad here. I've got the Dremel on a pretty low speed, and we're going to polish that ramp. So that'll give you an idea. I'm going to do the rest of the I'm going to polish the entire sear. I'll do that off camera. One final step you can do if you like is to polish your feed ramp where the round goes into the barrel here. This one's already polished mirror-like. Like I said, I've actually shot this video, I just lost it. But I'm going to go ahead and give it a bit more polish here just for completeness sake. So for this you need some kind of stiff felt polishing pad. I have one here on my Dremel. I've got some polish I put on it, and basically all you're going to do, start off at a low speed, and that's basically all there is to that. Again, you don't want to be sanding this ramp at all. You're just going to be using the Dremel and some metal polish. One other thing you can polish is the catcher on the striker. Let me zoom in a bit. So this piece here, this angled piece here, is what catches the sear. So you can polish the face of that. Don't sand it. You don't want any material off of this. So you can just polish it with a bit of metal polish. And I'll go ahead and do that now. So the final step before we reassemble this is to clean out the burr marks where the safety plunger goes in. Now you won't be able to see this on camera, but I did look through a magnifying glass. There are some machining marks in there which could affect when the plunger is in, especially this back wide piece scraping up against the burrs inside. So you can use a small piece of doweling. This happens to be a chopstick. You're going to wrap some very, very fine grit sandpaper. Again, you're just letting a little bit of friction do the work here. You're not going to be rubbing up and down. I'm just going to insert it. Now that I'm all the way through with the sandpaper, I'm just going to give it a couple of turns. And again, I'm going to insert it from the other side and do the same thing. Again, this is a 1500 grit, so we're not really doing much. I'm hoping it removes the burrs though. So that's it for the slide. So what I'm going to do now is put all the parts I worked on, actually the entire, all the parts from the gun, into my sonic cleaner. I'll put a link below about sonic cleaning. I did a previous video on how well that does. So I'm going to go ahead and do that, get this thing cleaned up, and I'll come back to reassemble. Okay, now we start the reassemble of the frame. First thing we need to do is get the sear block back together. Got the sear here, the little plunger that sits on top of this yellow spring here, and the pin that holds it all in together. If the spring came out, it's not impossible to get in by any means. It's just a bit of a pain in the butt. this little topper for the spring came out on mine, so I'm gonna have to grab it. My tools are slightly magnetized. I'm just gonna insert it into that spring. That's in, and the sear goes in. Here's the ejector, just to show you the way the sear goes in. I believe it can only go in one way anyway, but this angled piece here goes forward with the smooth part of the sear facing up or toward you. So you basically just get the sear in place, press it in. It's got to be pressed in pretty far. You'll be able to see through this hole when everything's lined up. You grab the pin, the small end, whoops, my sear popped out. See what I mean? Let's get that back in again. So I'm going to start the pin in, get everything lined up, and there we go. You can just press on the back of the sear to make sure it's returning all right. Now we can get this into the frame. Okay, the sear housing or the sear block, whatever you want to call it, just inserts in the back of the frame. Again, push it down as far as it'll go. I'm going to drive all the pins in at the same time once I have the entire thing reassembled. You can put the rear pin in now though if you like. Next we put the roll pin in the rear of the firearm. These roll pins are identical. The two roll pins that this firearm uses are identical, so it doesn't matter which one you use for the rear and for the slide. So I'm just going to get it started here. Now if you're lucky enough to have a set of roll pin starter punches, these are hollowed out at the end to hold the roll pin. You can go ahead and use that. If not, you can use a regular punch, but make sure you somehow secure this roll pin as you're punching it in, as not to bend it. These roll pins are a very snug fit. Once you have it in a certain distance, you're going to have to switch to your regular punch or roll pin punch. So I'm going to grab my roll pin punch here. It's going in slowly. I kind of wish Smith & Wesson had to use the same pins as Glock uses. The Glock ones go much easier. So you want to get that in just so it's flush on both sides. Probably use another hit. Okay, that looks good. Without a doubt, this is probably the hardest part about reassembling the Smith & Wesson. All three of these pieces have a hole in common. This hole here, the slide lock, and the top of the trigger. All these have to be lined up for you to put this pin through, and at the same time it has to go through the frame. So it goes through the frame, then the locking block, and then the slide lock, and then the trigger. And this is a real pain in the butt to do while all this you're trying to get lined up inside the frame. So I think I found a solution. I dug through a box of roll pins I had. I found one that fit nicely as a starter pin that you can join all these pieces together before you insert the whole thing in one unit into the frame. So if you have a roll pin or a regular pin, this is about 16 millimeters long by about 3.5 millimeters wide. It'll make the job a lot easier. So the first thing we need to do is get the trigger spring on. Now it's important that this go on correctly. One end has a closed loop, the other end has an open loop. The open loop gets hooked on to this hole in the trigger bar. Now it needs to be hooked on like this. Just zoom in here. So it needs to be hooked with the opened end facing the top of the firearm, facing the top of the trigger. So the easiest way I found to do this is to grab the spring, loop it in through the hole, and then swing it back. Incidentally, the other end of the spring is what lines up with this hole as well. So again, just to reiterate, this spring, once it's in, you'll know it's in properly when the gap, the top part of the spring, is open toward the top of the trigger. Okay, now comes the tricky part, to use our starter pin to put all these together before we put it back in the frame. You can leave aside this little spring now. This is for the takedown lever. It goes in this slot here, but if you put it in now as you're manipulating all this stuff, it's just going to fall out. So I'm going to put that aside for now and put that in just before we put everything back into the receiver. So what I'm going to do is start this pin, rest it here just like that. The slide lock lever, make sure this spring is facing up. This is the top of the locking block. You can tell because this is where the slide runs against. So I'm going to put that in, insert this pin just a little bit more, if I can get it lined up with that hole there. Okay, I put it in too far, but that's okay. So I'm just going to push it back over. The next thing is to put the trigger in. And again, it has to go through this hole here at the top of the trigger. So I'm going to start that by gently pushing in my starter pin again. Okay, that's in. Now I need to push it back again just so we can have room to put this spring in. Now sometimes this spring will cooperate and just kind of fall in place and line up. And it actually did this time. So you can see it's caught on there now. If not, you'll just need a screwdriver, small screwdriver, just to manipulate it and make sure that pin goes through. So now I can push this pin through the rest of the way. And I want it flush on the side of the locking block here. Again, you might have to wiggle things around for it to go all the way through. Okay, there we go. So now we have this unit actually all together. Okay, I'm going to show you something in the frame here. The end of the trigger bar, which I'll show you in a second, needs to be inserted. There's a slot just beside the sear here. In fact, my screwdriver can go right inside it. Okay, so we have everything together, ready to go in. This piece of the trigger bar here, the small piece here, needs to go in that slot I just showed you back here beside the sear. So what we can do is start to rest this in. What I'm going to do is hook the trigger in like so. I'm going to push this trigger bar down just slightly, make sure it slides into that slot, and it just did. Now before you start pushing this locking block in, you don't want to forget about the that spring that goes in here for the takedown lever. So I'm going to grab that. Okay, I'm going to hold it down with my screwdriver here. Get this started. Now you have to make sure everything else is lined up properly. So I've got my trigger, the back of the trigger bar is in that slot I was talking about. Now you can start pushing things down gently. Make sure this slips out on me all the time when I do this, so just give it a gentle nudge just to unstick it. Okay, you don't want to bend your trigger bar. Be careful you don't bend your trigger bar. Now I can push everything back down. and everything is in. Check your trigger, make sure it moves smoothly. Now comes the great part. All these parts are already in line. If you didn't have that starter pin, you'd have to put the locking block in, you'd have to put your slide lock lever in, and the trigger and the spring, and try to manipulate everything to get it lined up as you're putting this pin in. But since I used that other pin, all we have to do at this point now is just hammer in the main spring. And you'll see here, little starter pin came out. I'm just going to make sure this pin is in flush. And that's it. Last step is to put in the takedown lever. Again, pretty simple. Just insert, turn, and just manipulate it until it goes into the other side of the frame here. Again, with a new firearm, this can be a little bit tight. There we go. The last pin we need to put in is the other pin that goes through the locking block. This one doesn't have to go through any other parts like that other pin did. So I'm just going to put that in now. Again, it doesn't matter what side of the firearm you put this in from. Again, I'm going to use my bolt pin punch. My roll pin starter punch first. And finally finish it off flush. Okay, that looks good. We're done with the frame. Okay, to put the safety plunger and the safety plunger spring in, you're going to need to put your slide back in the vise and punch in your rear sight through this side. I'm not going to put that on camera because if you've taken it off, you should be able to put it in. The trick is to put the plunger in, put the plunger spring in, then you're going to grab your rear sights, kind of get them started before you move it to the bench. You need to push down this cover. As you slide it over, make sure this plastic top doesn't get pinched. So I'm just going to slide it over. That's about as far as I can get it. I'll just take it to my vise, punch it in, screw it down. You can add some red Loctite there again if you like. I recommend you don't do that because these sights might need adjusted once you've taken them apart. So take it to the range, shoot it a couple of times, and make sure everything's good. Now finally we can assemble the rest of the slide. So you're going to put your striker in. You notice it stops about there. You need to depress the plunger to get it in the rest of the way. And you'll see when you release it now, it will no longer come out. Next we just grab the slide cover. We can get it started. And then we're just going to grab a punch or something and depress the back of the striker and push the slide on. And finally the barrel and the recoil spring. Check it for function. Oh boy, that feels a lot smoother. Okay, I took the Smith & Wesson to the range to make sure it functioned properly. And it did. I fired about 150 rounds, combination of Federal, Blazer, and Winchester 9mm ammo. I did do a trigger pull test on it. It could be coincidence, but as I said at the beginning of the video, this tested straight out of the box at about 7 pounds 5 ounces. I was getting average of about 7 pounds right on, 7 pounds 0 ounces, and sometimes a couple ounces less than that. So it seems we've saved between 5 and 7 ounces. But if you really want to lighten this trigger up, I suggest you get a trigger kit. There's one made by Apex, and oddly enough, mine came in the mail just as I was finishing up this video. So I'll probably do a video of the install of the Apex trigger kit, and hopefully that will lighten this up a lot more. But if you don't want to spend the money on this, by all means, do the trigger job. At least you'll get it a lot smoother. Thanks for watching, and please subscribe.